part of the same strategy, if you want to call it that, or means of reacting to the situation they're in. Anyway, should we go to Joanna first and then Sir Shaggy?
Yeah, thank you. And Axel, wonderful to hear you again. It's been a while because of me, because I'm usually not in the space at this hour, but wonderful to hear you again. I just wanted to address the thing that you said about, the value of the equipment that is given and how it's calculated, because I think many don't understand there are three types of value. There is the replacement value, there is the accounting value, and there is the commercial value. So it's only normal for a country that is giving away the equipment, either selling it or donating it, it doesn't matter, to have for internal purposes taking into account the replacement value. Because if you are giving away two tanks, you have to think about how much it costs to have two other tanks, two new tanks. And usually the replacement value is quite high. On one side because of the inflation, on the other side because the equipment that replaces the old equipment is usually more advanced with more technology, newer, and so on and so forth. So the replacement value is quite high. The accounted value is taking into account the depreciation, and it's kind of a linear way because the accountants are lazy and they wanted to have things very clear. So practically the value of the accounted value is decreasing constantly over a number of years, 20, 40, doesn't matter, the shelf life of the equipment. So using this is not good either because it's not the real value of the equipment. The real value is the commercial value. And it can be very different, for example, it depends on the competition, it depends on the new technology, if there is a lot of innovation in, if it is a second hand or older equipment, it depends on what others are willing to pay for it. And also, if it's towards the end of the shelf life, so to say, it may be very, very low. So, how do you think that US or other countries should calculate the value of the equipment they donate? I believe it should be somewhere close to the commercial value. What do you think?
Was that addressed to Axel? Personally, I think
It
that
was rather to you,
to me, yeah, yeah.
but it's okay.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. I mean, well, it's not really my area at all. But in principle, if they say they're providing $60 billion, that's what they should provide. They're saying they're providing $60 million worth of assistance, but that's not actually what they're providing at all. It's complete nonsense, and they should actually be listing. They should actually be saying that the actual value of the kit they've provided. Now, the value of some military equipment, which is 20 or 30 years old, needs replacement anyway, and probably has a limited sort of shelf life, which is fine because they're going to use it very quickly. Is of a far lower value, literally a fraction of what they are saying for the replacement value. Therefore, what they're quoting is totally disingenuous and does not at all represent a realistic representation of what they have actually provided, which is nowhere near the value of the figures they're quoting. So that's what they should be doing. They should, with equipment also, obviously the ammunition that's going to be expended and is not reusable. But things like Patriot batteries, they are going to hopefully, if there's enough of them, remain there after the war and could be returned to the sender. So there's no reason why Ukraine has to be gifted these or has to even own them. They just need use of them. So they just need a more creative mechanism to allow Ukraine to use this stuff and defend themselves without, saying that we've given them X billion dollars of assistance and this and that. And, it's a lot of it's just smoke and mirrors, I'm afraid. But because that's the way they account for it, that's what people believe. And that's what has political traction in the States. And then, therefore, why you've got people saying, up in arms, saying, we've given Ukraine $60 billion, that's enough. We can't keep on pumping money at them. Well, actually, you haven't given them $60 billion at all. You've given them nowhere near that, realistically. And in any case, that is only 5% of your annual military budget anyway for the United States, and to knock out 50% or whatever it is of the Russian military equipment in 2 years is phenomenally good value for money for what is being achieved, and is probably the best defense money they will ever spend anywhere. So, this is what annoys me, is that they're not comparing apples with pears, and these numbers are being thrown around and have been used by effectively, accountant type people to construct ridiculous arguments that we have provided this level of help, when it really is not a fair indication of what has actually been provided. It's a complete distortion, and again, also allows the Russians to capitalize on this misinformation and sort of start agitating the American voters that they're pouring this astronomical sums of money into Ukraine, which are then is being used for corruption, which of course it isn't. The money isn't even going to Ukraine. But by allowing these sort of figures to be used, they are gifting an opportunity to the Russians for disinformation. And this should have been seen, and it should have been sorted out, and they should be quoting what is realistic figures of what has actually been given, rather than completely false, inflated figures of replacement equipment, which has nothing to do with the value of the equipment that's actually been given to them, and is likely to be more than 10 times as much as the figures what's actually been given to them. And this is just about fairness and transparency, and dealing with the problem in an appropriate manner, rather than dealing with it in what almost seems to be, in accounting terms, the most inappropriate manner and the most illogical manner, which is giving away political capital to the enemy, and that's just absurd. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts from me. I don't know. Should we go to Axel before we go to Sir Shaggy?
Of course, Minister. Of course. Very well said.
It's like something out of Yes Minister or Yes Prime Minister. If you've ever watched that British TV series where the civil service just distorts and disrupts and has their own agenda and tries to railroad the politicians into doing what the civil service wants to do. And yeah.
And that is exactly, well, many of those policies which have once created entitlements then continue to be followed through, because entitlements need to be what? Regularly monitored and administered. And that requires people in bureaucracy. That allows you to create more ministerial state secretaries. It requires more analysts, more people who can suss out whether these measures are balanced and correctly addressed and whatnot and budgeted. That's the whole thing. Too much government. But there you go. I think Shaggy and then Dan.
Yeah, cheers, Axel. Hello, hi, Peter as well. Yeah, with the yeah, I'm good. I'm normally in bed by now, so this is late for me. Yeah, on the accountancy thing, yeah, it's difficult to find a way of accounting. You don't want to tell the enemy how many actual tanks or whatever you've given to Ukraine, because that gives them an advantage. So using a monetary number kind of hides that a little bit. But then if you know how much you're accounting each tank for, then you can work out the number of tanks anyway. So yeah, it seems to me just a dick measuring contest, measured in billions of whatever, pounds or euros or dollars and stuff like that. We give them 60 billion, and then when you look at the detail, it's only about 20 billion, and 40 billion has gone back into the US economy. But on your GPS comment earlier on, Peter, I've heard from various different people. There's a difference between GLSDB and SDB. The SDB are the air launched ones, and the GLSDB are ground launched small diameter bombs. And yeah, there is a problem with the GPS on them. They use GPS quite a lot with a little bit of INS, inertial navigation system. Whereas, for instance, the ATACMS, different flight path uses more INS than GPS, and the longer the flight time is, the more the GPS, because of the Russian jamming, gets less and less accurate, and the ground launch ones are in the air for longer, and therefore are prone to jamming for longer, and therefore that's why they don't. That's why they become more more inaccurate than the air launched ones. But that's what I heard. So do your own research on that. But just those comments.
Dan.
Good afternoon or good evening. Peter, I totally loved what you said. I'm going to say I'll take A, B, and C, and I'm going to add a comment with the D. My comment is that all of the above of what you said, I agree totally with. Over here in the States, I see a grab bag full of mishandling, not only of what you said about the counting, the way they're working it, the way they're explaining it to the public, and the fact that my politician isn't, or my president isn't using it to bully pulpit more. And it should be a daily thing, a constant daily thing, just like Zelensky does with the Ukrainian people. He tells his constituents daily what's going on. We don't get that here. And when we get a disaster happening, like yesterday, the first feed we get from the press secretary of the White House is something about student loan debt being removed, which is great, which is fine. I don't have a problem with that. But I don't think it's a top news article. It's crazy. I'm totally disgusted, and my fear is he's going to put that other nut in the White House, or one of the nuts. That's my fear, but it's not a fear because I have plans. I'm not sticking around much longer for this mess. This is crazy. But yeah, it's totally bullshit. But I agree totally with what you said.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Of course, something like, yeah, you're absolutely right. Something I didn't touch on at all, which is equally valid, I think, and equally important, is exactly as you say, that the poor communication job that unfortunately the current regime, the current sort of administration in America has done at explaining the importance of defending Ukraine to its population. I mean, it almost hasn't bothered doing it, which is ridiculous given how important it is to all, America's future in the world, the sort of norms of law and order, and to those people who think that this is some faraway place in Europe and doesn't really affect America, and we can just batten down the hatches and do what we did in 1938, and then find that world events catch up with us and we get caught up in Pearl Harbor, which is, broadly speaking, what is likely to happen, because the Russians have made it absolutely clear that they are at war with us. And we know this from cyber espionage, cyber attacks. We know this from data cable and gas pipeline sabotage, from all manner of nefarious activity, sponsoring terrorism and proxies all around the world, and trying to undermine our democracy and our democratic institutions and our way of life and our everything that we stand for, and our values. So we do better to recognize that is the situation and deal with it, rather than try and ignore it and pretend that reality is somewhat different and that we can just kind of get by without having to take the difficult decisions and actually deal with them. And okay, Biden, love him or hate him, and there are people who on both sides of the fence, and probably includes here. He's got certain attributes. He's very experienced in politics and knows his way around the system, but he's never going to be the world's best communicator. That's just part of who he is. You can't expect everybody to have every sort of attribute. And therefore, perhaps he should take a bit of more advice on that, or he should delegate some of the communication, or what, I don't know. But certainly he should recognise that he's got a bit of an issue there, and it needs to be dealt with. And as you say, yesterday, when you have an absolutely appalling international atrocity is committed, and he comes out with something about student debt relief, which, yeah, okay, I didn't even know that, but that underscores the extent of the problem. Ukraine just is not top and center, and the threat to our security is just not being given the importance it deserves and it needs, because here you've got this malicious actor, basically a bunch of criminals, and why haven't they been declared terrorists and their whole regime declared a terrorist regime and treated accordingly, so that anybody who does business with them is gets blacklisted, and that would shut them down pretty damn quick, I can assure you. But they won't do it. Americans might then start to recognize the scale of the problem, because at the moment, I think, unfortunately, I have to say it, a lot of Americans are just in denial about the problem, and they don't seem to recognize that we are in a sort of 1938 type situation, particularly when you pile up the other problems of Hamas and China and North Korea and Iran, where you sort of put those in the frame, and you begin to get a picture that we are heading in a very unfortunate and very undesirable place, and we would do better to deal with it now while we still can, while we've got the ability to do that entirely via Ukraine, rather than having the problem blow up and get bigger and expand to other parts of the world, which it's already started to do. But we need to reverse that process and knock it on the head in Ukraine as quick as possible, and it's actually easily possible to do that with a relatively small fraction of our economic capability. And why on earth isn't that being done? And it all comes back to the same thing, I'm afraid, and that's weak political leadership. And however you slice it, I am afraid to say, although I am no supporter of the alternative, that has to be laid at Biden's doorstep. And for example, he should have fired Jake Sullivan a long time ago for just giving him crap advice. The guy is just not up to the job, and everything he's done has basically made the situation worse. And Biden isn't obliged to take his mistake, and Biden has to accept the bottom line, because the buck stops with him. But nevertheless, it is absolutely clear, I'm afraid, that Biden seems to accept the advice and the recommendations coming from Jake Sullivan, and Jake Sullivan exerts an undue influence over the White House policy, and I have to say that has been pretty catastrophic, particularly for all those Ukrainians who are no longer here to speak on their own behalf. And
Sullivan is in his job because the president keeps him there. We should be very clear about this.
Yeah, 100%. And when somebody continuously demonstrates total incompetence, and the policies that he is espousing, are seen to be complete failures time and time again, and by which I'm referring to virtually everything, this non-escalation policy towards Russia, which has just failed and failed and failed and failed again, and keeps on failing and will keep on failing while you continue to pursue it. You shouldn't need to be the person with the biggest IQ to work out that you need to change course, and this policy is doomed, and we do better off ditching it and putting something stronger in place, particularly when there's plenty of examples like the Turkish who shot down a Russian aircraft in Turkish airspace, and guess what happened after that? How many Russian aircraft have come back? And if we took the same approach with the grey fleet on the oil high seas, if we did it with the same approach with data cable and gas pipeline sabotage and all the other nefarious activity that the Russians are behind, sort of promoting, and that includes.
Peter, we lost your audio.
Sorry, and that, and yeah, and the all the data cable problems and the gas pipeline sabotage and all the other nefarious activity that the Russians are behind, then you know, our policy and our sort of reactions might be rather more effective, and that includes, of course, dealing with China very severely and whacking a load of secondary sanctions on them now, not later, now, including each time they start behaving aggressively towards Taiwan, bang, whack them with something totally disproportionate in response that really cripples them economically and makes life really difficult for them, so that it's going to be very difficult for them to continue on their current path. Or if they do, there is a disproportionate cost to them and their entire economy if that's the path they want to continue on. And thereby it will become very difficult for them to fund their future war against Taiwan, because it's the economy that is going to provide the finance to fund their sort of military dreams in the same way that the Kremlin has basically fallen apart with. So anyway, that's a few thoughts from me. Apologies for the loss of audio. I managed to put my finger on top of the microphone, which I do occasionally. Apologies for that.
No worries, but I mean, it's certainly true. And thank you very much for highlighting this again, that making matters for Russia disproportionately costly is a vital step in winning. You need to simply not just attrit your enemy, you need to threaten their existence and break their spine. And in this case, that is both economically as well as militarily possible. Economically, we have by far not exerted enough pressure. And militarily, we have failed to assist the Ukrainians with what they need, despite the fact that militaries and military leaders do know exactly what is required. And contrary to the non-truthful, you could say, lies, the non-truthful statements of the likes of Celeste Wallander, who serves as a civilian in the DoD at the behest of the Biden administration, who comes to Tallinn and at the Leonard Mary conference says that the administration has delivered everything the Ukrainians have demanded. She said that. She's on the record. It's wrong. It has been denied by the whole Ukrainian government. It has been even called into question by numerous military officials working in the administration, who all, of course, now have to fear for their pension and the likes, because Ms. Wallander is a nihilistic authoritarian in her government. That's how far it goes. The kowtowing and derogation of expert military advice is one clear rule since the days of the first Obama administration, and it has continued. It hasn't, even in the days of the rather chaotic Trump days, where at least for the first 2 years we had Jim Mattis, who managed to organize things better, but thereafter that changed. And the military tried to escape from overly intense demands and intrusions, but still, we still see the same thing, that there are very specifically ideologically minded apprentices at work. That needs to stop. We can't afford it, and it's not a matter of politics. It's really, it shouldn't be a matter of politics. This is national security. It is actually global security for those nations which consider themselves free and partners of this alliance of free democracies. And if you look at it, we have the same issue in a different format in Germany. We have a rather navel-gazing, very specifically minded and absent France. We have Britain, which, for reasons which are vested in their own political class, since the second major government has attrited and reduced to rubble the funding of the armed forces. I just saw something yesterday very briefly, in passing, an interview with people who typically really don't have to talk about military policy that much, who in 2009 highlighted in a very entertaining fashion, right in front of the then say occupant of number 10, and they did continue this, by the way, in 2012, that the armed forces were terribly underfunded. Well, guess what? That hasn't changed. On the contrary, it has become much worse. We live in very strange times if we allow our political elite to be even more complacent than we all have been ourselves. And it's bewildering if you think about it, that we take the media, take the cultural side of things. And by the way, because people have now started talking about the fact where these quotes are from, everything is downstream from culture. Is actually everything derives from culture. It's something which is deeply vested in the understanding of the Renaissance, and it's very important that we understand what the cultural fabric of is, which we adhere to and which we're part of, and what it means for us. Because if you think about the fact that we still have today, whether it's now Apple TV with its Masters of the Air, whether it is a few years ago the Americans going out with a third version of the whole drama of what is either Band of Brothers, Pacific, or previously Saving Private Ryan, whatever Mr. Spielberg and people and others are touching upon, in terms of keeping the at least one part of the puzzle, of the mosaic of history, of defeating authoritarianism in the Second World War alive. And the audience numbers were absolutely spiffing. Band of Brothers is still today considered to be one of the most successful series ever screened, and HBO has had great success in the US with it, if I'm not quite mistaken. And the same thing in its, let's say, overall global syndication. Now, even with the, so to say, atomization of media markets and perception with the distribution of streaming services and likes, and therefore less cohesiveness in what populations and groups and regional groups view, and therefore you can see the splintering, which leads to less joint understanding, the fewer joint events which coin what is the cultural perception, what moves cultures, what is momentous, whether it is, I don't know, if the Germans have this wonderful thing that everything which comes back with 1954 and 1974, the two World Cup say wins, and then 2014 or the 2060, the World Championship they hosted at home, and football for the Germans is equally important as it is, of course, for the Brazilians and the Brits and the likes, and the Italians for that matter. But if you think about it, if these events are the only events where a whole population, a whole country comes together, then that's very little. And in television, that's why I was quoting those regurgitations and these reviews of past defense of freedom, which still attract a lot of people. But if these are now in atomized streaming services, people stop discussing them amongst themselves. There is no feedback loop. We become more and more consumers of all of this. And the complacency of the modern society which we live in today in 2024, and I'm not trying to be gloomy and doomy and, oh gosh, I'm old and they are young and they are all so foolish. No. On the contrary, I'm not talking about the wisdom of the elderly here. We're not going full Seneca quite yet. But, I mean, we might. And why not, actually? Well, maybe I'm right. Anyway, having said this, we are currently, or large parts of society have become so consumerist and so happy in their little bubble. And of course, everybody is busy with themselves and their whatever they do in their lives, education, life, families, health strains, businesses, work, you name it, all of that. But unless there is a cohesive cultural response to the atrocities committed, to the war waged against the West, unless there is a reverberation in society all across the West, the politicians will fail to act. And we can see this. We can see that President Biden only has responded when there was significant pressure publicly, obviously, cast through media, through Congress and the likes. People should remember, I made this statement at the beginning of us joining here, Peter, you and me, that this is the administration where the president himself said, made this infamous statement about a minor incursion, which then became a full-scale invasion with the atrocities, which didn't culminate, but were showcased in Bucha. But they happen every single day. And they have actually been happening since 2014, since this war began. And the Americans knew that. And President Biden was briefed on that, and he knew that. And still he tolerated this, his own statement of the minor incursion. So if you go through all these things and look at the fact that the politicians only react to pressure, certain politicians are even so stupid that they don't react to pressure. So Olaf Scholz comes to mind in that regard, because they are so utterly stubborn and holding on to their specific ideological bias that they won't move. So the pressure has to be so intense that somebody comes to replace them. So in certain countries, because of coalition mathematics and different setups, that is feasible and it's possible, and it could happen even in between elections. In other countries where there is a more, shall we say, polarized setup, be it Britain, be it the US, elections have to happen. But even then, you get an election and you only have one alternative, and the alternative is not in any shape or form much better. Now, there you go. So this is what we currently have to deal with. And we as the population, we here as little volunteers, as people with a mobile phone and the likes, we are obligated to act. As our friend Ben Hodges said, if you have acknowledged a problem, if you have acknowledged a threat, you're obligated to do something about it. If they haven't acknowledged it, our politicians, but we have, we're obligated to do something about it. We have to argue, we have to volunteer, we have to be loud, we have to be effective, we have to talk to people. And it's not about admonishing them all the time. It's winning them over, making them understand why it matters. But there you go. Dan, please. Dan?
Am I on? Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all of the above. It makes perfect sense. One of my concerns is, though, when Peter was talking, the first thing that hit my brain was we have polarized factions within our security apparatus, not just in our country, but I think throughout other countries, it's in there too. I'm wondering if we've left ourselves short there in the security apparatus, and if we've also, as a society, Western democratic society, if we've left ourselves short with our pants around our ankles as far as being able to mobilize military equipment in a quicker fashion in a timely manner and make it less political. Does that make any sense? I'm sorry.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and it is one part or one stone of the whole mosaic that we've allowed, we as the populations have allowed ourselves and the bureaucrats and the administrative setups, the agencies, the departments of defense, all of them to become focused on all sorts of signals they believe they need to react to, signals from society. These demands are not necessarily all helpful. And the reaction by all these institutions is also not necessarily meaningful. The most important thing about the United States Armed Forces and all their format, the most important thing about the French, the German, the British, the Swedish, the Finnish armed forces is that they are ready to fight and win. Yes, they will always be a reflection of society in one form or another. But first and foremost, they have to be trained and equipped to be the most comprehensively mustered, well set up, crafted, and designed fighting force to defend freedom, because that matters more than anything else. Without freedom, nothing is anything. Failing that, we fail ourselves. You're absolutely correct. Pickled.
Hey, thanks, Axel. Hi, Peter. Thank you for hosting this space and the opportunity to be in the speaker panel. Hey, so Axel, while I completely agree with the sentiment that you just voiced, I think you're, I don't know. It seems to be that this type of feedback loop, right, where society has to be basically, an enforcer for politicians to do the right thing. Probably better suited maybe for European style government, I would guess, because here in the United States there is a certain social contract. I think the elected politicians, are expected to fulfill, right? Because they are not Martians who all of a sudden landed and got elected because they promised or had a successful, election campaign. They share the same set of values. They share the same, social attributes, I guess, if you will, right? Just like you were mentioning, in military being the reflection of society, so are the politicians. Now, I think you're right. We cannot really expect them to do the right thing. In fact, we probably should expect the opposite. But the feedback loop that to me, what it looks like here in the United States, the feedback loop that we have with politicians that we elect is really limited to an election cycle. And by then, if there was a hard lesson for them to learn, it's really almost impossible for them to recover because they're just not going to be elected. Therefore, the learning curve is rather short and probably ineffective because they're not going to be able to apply it because they've been fired, right? Instead, I think we shouldn't. I mean, we definitely need to have, social uproar about any types of inefficient policies that, like, let's say, Biden administration is implementing, or any other form of government at whatever level. But at the same time, I think we really need to be vocal about telling them, like, look, we expect you to do better. You're supposed to be doing this without us having to assemble, right? Because I think there's a lot of people in the United States, right? And I know it's a very ambiguous thing, and maybe it's just the echo chambers that I reside in, but I suspect that a lot of people support Ukraine. And generally speaking, they would kind of go along with whatever president, let's say administration, as long as it's backed up by legislation, decides to do as far as providing whatever military aid for Ukraine, because they are busy with everyday life stuff, right? Nobody's going to be able to commit themselves to the level, um, to this particular issue if they feel it's too far away for them, right? Because they have to go work, they have to take care of their daily activities and do other things. There's very few in between people who would be able to really kind of put a lot of energy into this one single issue, right? Because again, it's not a monolithic society. There's a lot of domestic problems that also affect the political attitudes and all that stuff. But in general, I think it should be uh, fair to say that we expect our elected leaders to do the right thing. And that means, defending democracies, allowing people who've been served injustice to defend themselves with whatever means necessary, calling out and communicating policies and or their positions towards certain actions, right? And this is again, I think I'm probably repeating a lot of stuff that you already mentioned and other people on this panel. And really wish President Biden would be a lot more strategic and more vocal about his communication to all the stuff that is happening right now in Ukraine. And I think that could really cost them a lot, because I wouldn't be surprised if we get closer to presidential elections. We will be able to see, from his position, right? The other side of the camp, political spectrum. Even those that are on the far right, kind of, Trump supporters, even, and all that stuff, all of a sudden adapting this. Support Ukraine all of a sudden because it's going to be beneficial for us to win some of the margins, maybe, with those people votes of those people who view this political, or who view this problem in Ukraine a big political sway, right? So yeah, I was just kind of sorry. I'm thinking out loud here and trying to reflect on some of the points that you made. But again, I think uh, you know the fact that Biden is playing way too careful is going to cost him, which is whatever. That's not why I'm in this space, right? But ultimately, I think it's still hurting Ukraine. He should have been a lot more aggressive, in my humble opinion, and take risks and take chances. And I think Ukraine would benefit a lot better. The world would benefit a lot better, especially our allies, and it would have been a lot better for him politically. But anyway, yeah, I think our politicians really need to be communicated that look, there's no learning curve for you. It's either you do the right thing based on the social contract that we had when we elected you, because you are sharing the same set of values, or you're getting fired, right? But unfortunately, in that particular situation, I think a lot of other people would lose anyway because the new people that would come in to replace the old guards or whatever, they probably, I don't know, hopefully they would do better, right? But there's no really that finally defined uh, loop back to where it would allow them to correct the behavior. Maybe, I don't know. Just thinking out loud. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts. Much appreciated. And by the way, let me just bring one more point home before we go to Leo. I think it is very telling that Sweden, as the most recent NATO member, has now stated the obvious, because Finland, for example, has never ever put any limitations on any of the weapons Finland has delivered. Quite on the contrary, they were asked once very much at the beginning, and they said that weapons are there to be used, period. That was once, right at the beginning. And these are, as you will probably remember, the shortest press conferences there are. But the Swedes highlighted earlier today that every Swedish weapon, of course, can be used in order to hit Russian targets, military targets in Russia. No question about it. It's a vitally important piece of the puzzle yet again. So we're putting our puzzle together. Leo, what do you have for us?
Hey there, Axel. Great discussion. Great to hear you and Peter and everybody participating in this. Yeah, interesting thing. I have, in my lifetime, there have been 13 presidents passing through in the United States. And I remember policies by, well, I was big enough to understand what was going on for the last 8 or 9 presidents. But over that time, the one thing that was kind of most people don't think about it, but I think it was the most brilliant thing that I ever saw a US president do was what George Bush Sr. did. And I wasn't a huge fan of his in general, but what he did when he wanted to get Saddam Hussein out of Iraq, out of Kuwait, he gave him a 90-day countdown. And the power of a countdown is something that, for some reason, people rarely tap into. It's a very, very powerful way of doing things. I used to discipline my kids by counting to 5. And if I got to 5, hell broke loose. And they always came running right at 4. They always finally obeyed whatever you're telling them to do when you got to 4, because they didn't want to see what happened at 5. And, I think that in dealing with Russia, Putin has been a master of calling the shots and making the West react. We're sort of relegated to reacting rather than calling the shots. But what I think we ought to do is have a daily tab on Putin that for each day that the war continues, something bad happens to Russia. And we could decide what that is. It could be economical. It could be a new sanction. It could be a new weapon delivery to Ukraine, like another F-16 is going to be promised to Ukraine based on the fact that day 855 has now passed. And as every day accumulates, let Russia see that they are getting into a worse and worse trap. Because right now, it's sort of like we've reached this steady state. Russia bombs, sends a rocket and bombs an apartment building on a daily basis, and somehow we just like accept that that's just like, oh yeah, that's what happens. This is the new reality. and it should never be the new reality. But if we had a daily consequence on Russia, whatever it may be, we would, the whole world would see that, wait a minute, this is actually working against Russia, and Russia has no business in being Ukraine. Russia could get out tomorrow. They could just pack up, and Putin could come up with a new explanation, because the people of Russia seem to believe anything that he says. He could come up with a new explanation why the strategy has shifted, and now the smartest thing is for Ukraine to, not be part of Russia, and Donbass, not be part of Russia, and just go home. But anyway, I think that it's really critical that we do that, that we figure out a way to use time to our advantage, rather than ignoring the clock and just waiting for drastic critical events to happen, like another catastrophe, another Novokokka Dam, another Bucha. Those are the only times that we seem to react. Anyway, you guys are great. Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. And Leo, thank you very much. I like the idea because it coincides with what we successfully did for a little bit during 2022, when the Europeans and Americans, the coalition of the willing, started, also obviously coordinated within the Rammstein format of the contact group. They started implementing sanctions pretty much on a daily basis, highlighting support for Ukraine, progressing matters, such as, for example, then the NATO accession of Finland and later on Sweden, but also the coordination of NATO's reallocation of forces. Then the commitments made by various NATO nations to support the northeastern flank alongside everything, integrating Ukraine's logistics into what we do in Rzeszów, helping Ukraine, for example, the winterization campaign in 2022 throughout the winter of 2023, supporting its build. There were many, many good individual messages, but the frequency was not high enough. And I think there you're absolutely right. This needs strategic communication. I think we've been saying this here jointly many times before, that if the political will were to culminate in the house of Biden, quite literally, if President Biden were to take it upon himself to see that a strong leader, no matter all other political fields, a strong leader will be perceived as someone to be trusted more to handle security, and therefore can then project from thereupon onto domestic policy. Yes, I do agree that you don't win elections in the US by foreign policy, in very few, with very few exceptions. But foreign policy can be the lead item with which you project who you are and what you do. And in this instance, as a national security crisis, that is vitally important. And if he were to take up the mantle, the bully pulpit, as the Americans call it, and communicate, we can see this. Remember the days a few weeks ago when Monsieur Macron, not necessarily one of the most unambiguous people on the planet, actually started turning around and starting speaking more forcefully. People were excited, and not just those who are in the national security or the policy bubbles and the likes, but it was many people in all across various media segments and levels of society. You could hear this, and because it was also surprising to them, that's good. Leading by surprising the enemy means also surprising your own people with clarity and communicating. And I think if our leaders in this instance were to finally decide to communicate appropriately, say what the target is, that defeat Russia first in order to integrate the otherwise forming axis of evil, and name it the axis of evil, and then set a time frame that within 1 year we want to achieve the following, and set that goal. Whatever can be achieved within that goal time frame will be achieved, because we are capable of so much more than just a few small goals. But I think, Leo, this is what you had in mind, right?
Well, absolutely, absolutely. And just really the whole idea that every day should have a consequence. Every day there should either be a new war crime announced, because we know that there's Alexandra Matvichuk says that they've counted 100,000 more crimes at this point. So if every day that it continues, there is a negative consequence, then we won't be, the world won't be kind of numbed into this homeostatic situation where it's just like, this is just what happens. Yeah, another 100 days have passed and Ukraine is still at war. No, every day there should be some sort of escalation so that Russia is painted into a corner and can choose at any time to get out of that corner. That's really what we'll just be the facilitators of Russia making the decision to get out of Ukraine. Thanks a lot. Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. No, I concur. It's a very important piece of the puzzle. But then again, it's also, we need to guard ourselves against certain learned reflexes our political class has developed in the complacent center and center left of politics. And I have to say it's center left of politics more often than not, because unfortunately I can't say that the apprentices of Mr. Rhodes as well as Jake Sullivan were necessarily center right. They weren't. And it doesn't matter why that is. We just have to say that these guys were not qualified for their jobs, unfortunately, because they never, ever failed to trap themselves in defeatism, in appeasement. They never fail to do the wrong thing at the right time. It's astonishing. A few days ago, Mr. Putin's propaganda arms come out and highlight that again. First, they let it seep in throughout the earlier in the week, right after the Leonard Mary conference, that, oh, yeah, well, of course, no, Putin would, of course, negotiate. And it's very important that the war ends. Then they activate all the sources. You can see this both in the United States as well as in media in Southern Europe, as well as in Southwestern Europe, Portugal, Spain, specifically. Spain is currently very vulnerable to this, as are certain parts of Italy, but not necessarily Miss Meloni, who's really not quite fond of Putin anymore at all. But that happens. So there's a lot of messaging going on, trying to integrate themselves and ingratiate themselves in different media markets, put the message out. You can sense it already. And whilst at the same time, obviously, other messages are being put out, then the narrative comes up. And right after that, Putin's troops, of course, are ready to hit not only Kharkiv and Odessa and other, they hit in Kharkiv this DIY market and the likes. They continue to build up steam in order to advance on Sumy if they could find a way to break through, but by trying to extend the front for another 90 to 110 kilometers to put more pressure on Ukraine. They shoot every single day. The combat activity in recent 4 days has been higher than on average than in the previous month. This is all due to the fact that they plan to constantly deceive and move the needle on the media side. Because what happened? Mr. Sullivan signaled that, of course, no, well, we should not escalate and maybe there's a possibility to end the war. No, the possibility to end the war is by defeating Russia militarily and economically. And yes, you have it in your hand because bloody hell, it's the United States of America. You have all the tools and you have an alliance. And this alliance, funnily, is bigger than NATO even, because this coalition is actually A, quite willing, and B, quite well equipped. And economically, those now it's 53 nations. Even if you were to discount, members who are more members of convenience, be it, even if you were to discount Turkey, even if you were to, and this is, forget about the drone deliveries and whatnot, what Turkey does, but even if you were to discount Turkey, even if you were to discount the current muddle in Slovakia, albeit the Slovakian industry is still working, of course, in tandem with their brethren or their cousins in the Czech Republic and supplying lots and lots of good goodies to the Ukrainians. But if you were to get, discount Mr. Orban, all right, do this all, you still have 50 countries and another 56, 50 countries whose GDP, I haven't consolidated that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it is not the 8 times bigger than NATO already has over Russia, but because we include Japan and South Korea in this, two absolute powerhouses economically. And of course, we would probably be able to outpace and outgun and outproduce Russia by so many times, by a factor of, I mean, so many, it's astonishing that we would be trying to humiliate ourselves by having low esteem of our capabilities. That is insane. This level of appeasement and sticking your head in the sand and seeking reconciliation and negotiation for the purpose of reconciliation and negotiation. This is not to be negotiated. The atrocities of a war of colonialism need to be refuted, remedied. There needs to be retribution, salting the earth on which they live by defeating them militarily, economically, and putting them in the doldrums and into the doghouse for a generation. What else? Peter, let me grab something nice and friendly from the fridge.
Okay, no problem with that. Grab away. Yeah, oh dear. Well, where do we start? I don't know. We've been saying this for a long time. I've been saying it for a long time. Sometimes I feel like I'm banging my head against a brick wall. But I think it needs to be said, and because it needs to be sort of kept in the forefront that, you know, the same still applies even after all this time. And, you know, all these things which we keep on banging on about are sort of reality and should be up there. And we shouldn't be distracted by all the guff and wibble that we hear coming from all sorts of angles, be it either the Kremlin or the Jake Sullivan directions or Olaf Scholz's of this world. And that, for a start, we know from our own history that if you don't deal with these tyrants appropriately, as Kasparov says, what happens is they escalate, and each time the cost increases for you to deal with it the next time. It always increases and becomes much more expensive to deal with. And we're about to find that in a really big way, because if we don't get Russia nailed pretty soon, we are going to find that China starts playing up, and we'll have a problem with China as well as Russia, as well as potentially Hamas and Israel, you know, all at the same time. And, you know, nobody on our side is going to win from that scenario. And if you've got, you know, we had the situation where we basically thought we had won the Cold War and it had been settled, and somebody thinks that is not the case. Perhaps we need to be a bit more assertive and prove once and for all that this is history. The Cold War has been won. We won it. And, you know, we're not prepared to have those arguments reopened. And Russia would no doubt be defeated for, and will be defeated for exactly the same reasons as the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. Basically, that the Kremlin is writing sort of military checks and what have you that his army cannot bank, and they can't impose their will on other nations and subjugate their neighbours in a way that they seem to think is acceptable, but isn't under any normal form of government and system other than, you know, effectively colonialism. Ironic that they're the ones who are railing against colonialism, but they're only referring to colonialism of the European powers and not their own colonialism, which frankly seems to be far worse given the way they treat some of their subjected countries. Anyway, that's just a few thoughts from me, and you know, the sooner we deal with it, the better. And just reverting the clock, had we dealt with it properly in 2014, we would never have found ourselves in the situation in 2022 when we had the full-scale invasion, because Russia would have been put firmly in its box and Crimea would have been taken back for Ukraine, and that should have happened. And the costs, economic costs on Russia, clearly should have been far more severe, so that they had been made clear to them that they cannot continue on this course of action, and that they would be better off basically sorting out the problems in their own country, which are absolutely huge, and rather than trying to create distractions and create artificial ratings successes within Russia internally on the basis of invading other countries and creating a fake surge in opinion polls on the basis of some foreign conquest here, there, or anywhere. And the Russian government's main responsibility should be its own security of its own territory. And in fact, its own territory is far larger than it should be due to its colonial nature, and it should be seeking to provide prosperity and security and a better standard of life for its own citizens, and not simply extorting and extracting and stealing all the money and keeping a bunch of criminals in power for as long as possible, and terrorizing the population and keeping them weak and subjected as basically slaves. And that's effectively what Russia has become. Anyway, maybe Axel is back from the fridge, maybe not, but we've got Lexicon with a hand up, so let's go to you, Lexicon.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, and Axel and everybody. Yeah, well, I think that the big part of the problem is that there is not unity on where we want to go in NATO, and there's like one big problem, and as you've mentioned, that's Schultz. I mean, Schultz, I just saw today him saying that Western weapons cannot be used on Russian territory for fear of this growing into a major war. I felt so insulted by this term. This might become a major war. I mean, the murders, the rapes, the abductions, the looting, the wholesale destruction is not, in a country that once had 50 million people, and this is not a major war. It's just one of the many disastrous speeches he makes. But I mean, this is the big block for Biden as well. I mean, it's the advice he's getting, and it's what Schultz is saying to him. I recall Biden saying, when he gets into his, looks a bit emotional to me, but he starts kind of lecturing the press. And so in that kind of setting, when he was saying, it was before he gave the first spindly few short-range ATACMS to when Zelensky visited. So it was before that visit, but he said, I will not take any step that threatens to split this alliance. And he was really in one of those, I would even say hectoring kinds of, he sometimes does that and looks very stern. And I think that Schultz talks like this, talks about how this absolutely would be destructive for NATO, and we in Germany have more knowledge than anyone of what could happen if Russia were to escalate, and all this kind of nonsense. But I think that remains a very big problem. Each one has got the excuse of the other. They're the two biggest producers and donors, and I'm not sure what goes up and down, what Germany's status is. But anyway, this is just a major population group, a major arms producer, and sitting there behind Ukraine and Poland, safely at a distance, and refusing to face up to what's happening. But to the condescension and the disregard of what has been happening to Ukrainian people on the bloodlands for the last 2 years and more is I found it absolutely incredible that he should use such language. He doesn't want this to develop into a major war. It's I found it quite upsetting, and so then they're creating this red line. And frankly, I saw when Medvedev made his crazy remarks also just yesterday, I suppose, that if any Western weapon is used on Russian territory, then we will have to respond with nuclear weapons. First of all, it's an interesting tacit accord that what Ukraine's been hitting before this, where the war's going on, is not Russian territory, and also acknowledging that what Ukraine's hitting them with on proper Russian territory is not any Western weapons; they're Ukrainian. But the fact is that by talking the way they're talking about not wanting an escalation and showing that this red line is there and it might escalate, it's just like showing the path for. You don't need to be as crazy or drunk as Medvedev to say, here's the right answer for those guys. Don't do it or we'll escalate. So, we've all gone on and on about how foolish it is, but I just found that there is a new low in destructive and ignorance of the reality, and a lack of obdurate unconcern for the travails and the losses of the Ukrainian people. I think it hits Ukrainian people very hard.
It does. You're absolutely right, Lexi. Let me just interject very briefly to support what your argument was, and highlight how critical it is. The German Chancellor is currently campaigning, of course, for his party, because he's also obviously a party leader. He's campaigning for his party for the European Parliament elections. For Americans and North Americans generally, Canadians included, that always sounds odd, because what is the European Parliament for? Well, it is the representation in Brussels within the otherwise slightly, more federated Commission and bureaucratically run European Union of the people's will, but it is only seen as a harbinger of politics and of votes and the likes, and it's a trend barometer, if you so like. However, with limitations, significant limitations. Also because the election participation rate is very, very low. Now, that may not be an issue for some people in America, where essentially you have very low vote participation rates. If you think about it, there are other nations where this is different. But still, the Chancellor campaigns currently on a peace ticket, meaning securing the peace, saving the peace. Therefore, you should vote his party. Saving the peace, because he, in his measures, his defensive measures, he states, and I'm paraphrasing or summarizing this, he says, our measures are there in order to ensure that this does not become an all-out war, that Ukraine can defend itself, but at the same time, he argues very clearly that Ukraine should not be allowed to hit Russia with German weapons. He is completely in line with this Biden administration. Now, ideologically, that is no surprise, because both come from the left. But Mr. Sullivan and Jens Plötner, Scholz's main advisor, seemingly get along quite fine in that regard. They both have this simplistic view of Russia, and that they need this additional pole. They also don't want to create too much of a hassle for China. The Germans, from the perspective of the SPD, should not necessarily be too aggressive against China. They don't like it that the Americans have taken a significantly harsher stance, but they do understand that they need to. They also don't necessarily understand Russia better, because it is Gerhard Schröder, the erstwhile hardcore leftist German chancellor, who ruined by shutting down German counterintelligence as one of his first measures, together with Joschka Fischer, the arch green legend of baseball bat wielding revolutionary days in Frankfurt, where he nearly he contributed to a long-term damage of a policeman lying on the ground whilst he was wearing motorcycle helmet and wielding a baseball bat. You fill in the blanks. And this guy was our foreign minister. He should never have been in any public office, of course. But then again, you get the government you deserve. And the Germans, see me in their ignorance and complacency and willful subservience to Russia, were willing to bank on this. And Schröder killed the counterintelligence. So the Germans, lexicon, do not necessarily understand Russia very well. They like a certain view of Russia, and they romanticize it, and they make huge mistakes with it. That is the key. And this is, and we've discussed it here at length, in extensio, in detail, comprehensively. I dissected for you the economic historical ties since the late 1960s. We went through what happened in the 19th century and medieval times. We've gone through all these things. I don't know how many hours. We probably have about 60, 70 hours on just that specific unholy alliance and cultural connection. And in a strange way, the funniest part is that the Germans have a very strong affiliation with large parts of Ukraine for a long time prior to the last 120 years. And specifically also, by the way, during the Industrial Revolution and up until the 1890s, very specifically, together with the British and certain French and certain Northern Italians, because they invested over there. Because prior to that, for hundreds of years, there was a significant cultural interchange. We are looking at people who project based on very simplistic views and very short horizons in history, policies for the future, with a clear lack of understanding of culture, with a clear lack of understanding of strategy, military strategy, and absolutely little record of service. Neither Mr. Plötner nor Mr. Schmidt nor Scholz, and definitely not Mr. Sullivan, were great servants in that regard in the military at all. So we should not be surprised. We are led by what one of our friends always has cast as pygmies and cowards, and that is not to derogate pygmies. I think the pygmies typically tend to be more courageous than many, given the fact that they are height impaired. But in this instance, we are really led by by people who are very small in stature. Lexicon.
I think, that it's actually even worse. And I was thinking about it again when when I saw that Schultz had made this statement, as might escalate into a major war, that a few days ago, it was around the time that Zelensky gave interview to some journalists, that the story was put together by Kiev Independent a couple days afterwards, 18th of May, I think they put it their story out. They give also he gave a sole or exclusive interview to AFP, I think, Agence France Presse, and he said in one, or who knows which one, but as reported by Kiev Independent, I believe, that the Western powers are threatening. I had to paraphrase, but it was clear that there is a threat that of aid being cut off if Western weapons are used. And I have been noticing that despite what the UK has said and what Sweden has said today and what France has not said, or said not, that we have not seen anything but Ukrainian weapons striking Russian sites. And I've been wondering about that. I know there's certain long distance and so on, but it sounds to me, I think Zelensky is hinting broadly that the US and Germany are actually able to say that it would have a serious impact on our country's attitude to arms deliveries if Western weapons were used in the Russian theater. And I think we see that they're not, because it's not, you could, everything else is American. At any rate, so I don't think that's an impossibility, but it's not happening. And I think that they're going further. I'm concerned that also that they will limit how the F-16s can be used, even though none of them are from America. Now, I had a bit of a discussion about this, a disagreement with Alan a little later last night about it, and he thinks absolutely no way America could have anything to say. But when you've got the very big purse, when you're the biggest guy in the whole school, you can say the things you want to say, and you can't just be punched in the face. It's you've got all the stuff, and you can take your marbles and go home. So I fear that that's going on as well, and it's a big concern that I think we ought to explore and address. We should look into it.
Jenny,
So I've seen rumors. Sorry, I've seen rumors that America also stops any Western weapons. Is that true? And if so, on what basis can they tell, like, Sweden not, or tell Ukraine not to use Swedish weapons in Ukraine when Sweden has said quite clearly, apparently? I'm glad that they actually came out and said it outright, but to use our weapons in Ukraine or in to strike military targets in Russia.
yeah, there are differences. If I may, just there are differences.
Sure.
The United Kingdom, Great Britain, Great Britain, for example, as the closest and most integrated ally of the United States within NATO and beyond that, for example, has stated very, very clearly at an early stage that its Storm Shadows and all the weapon systems it delivers can be utilized outside of Ukraine. However, and their lexicon is right, the US, meaning in this case, the presidency, this administration, has seemingly advised the Ukrainians that if and when Western weapons, Western delivered weapons were to be used outside of Ukraine and on Russian soil, that this would have a negative impact on the willingness of the administration to support Ukraine. So, and this is not just one rumor or anything. These indications have been around since the days when last year in February, Cavoli briefed the senators at the Munich Security Conference. This is nothing really new. So, and when you say on what authority, it's very straightforward and simple. If you are the leaders of the free world and you are the founding member of NATO and you have been providing security for all of the free world thus far, you are taken very seriously. The United States is the single largest military power, and also as an individual nation, still the single largest supplier of weapon systems for Ukraine. Whilst the EU may have now surpassed the US in terms of overall financial aid, that's not the case in terms of military aid. And this is an important feature. So there is something about the normative power of fact which we simply have to go by. And in this instance, it seems that the Biden administration has put a lot of, say, pressure on these matters. It is very good that Sweden comes out. It's also very good that Finland has, from the very get-go, told the administration. This is despite very good relations, by the way, the conservative Finnish president had at that point in time with President Biden. And it was Niinistö who, for example, flew across in view of Finland's say position to join NATO. And of course, America or the United States have been very much open for Finland joining NATO and have been very supportive of this. And they also would probably compromise more with Finland and Sweden at this point in time because they are that important to the overall northern flank and northern defense, and importantly also Arctic defense in the 21st century than many other parts of NATO. That is not to say that Spain is not important. They are all important. Every member of NATO is important, which is why it is such a tremendous and insidious stab wound which we've suffered with Hungary, which once was a very strong candidate to improve and transition out of post-Soviet occupation / domination and submission into freedom and democracy and the likes, and integration in terms of economics and all that kind of jazz. And Hungary, don't forget, still today hosts the transport wing of NATO, technically and formally, albeit that most of its efforts are not there in Hungary anymore, but the air base is there. The United States and NATO forces all are jointly building out their Romanian presence at the airport, which they had used for Afghan already. And they obviously, Jejuf now is essentially, I mean, J-Town is, how should I put this? It's one of the biggest military airports in Europe at this point. Of course, Ramstein is bigger, but it doesn't matter. So if you look at this, normative power of fact gives you the possibility to influence policy of others in consideration and in view of their future requirements, demands, and capabilities and support. So you would probably compromise more with Finland at the moment than with most nations. That's just what it is. But then again, do you have to compromise much? Probably not, because Finland is not supplying long-range or mid-range missile systems. If Finland had the same capabilities as France or the UK or Germany, and were to be the ones to say, well, Ukraine, here, have our Finnish Taurus, and thank you very much. And by the way, please make sure that you bomb Engels Air Base, because we really don't like it. And whilst you're at it, we can give you target information for pretty much every single relevant strategic bomber airbase in Russia, which you will need in order to take these bastards out and make sure that the threat is gone for the next generation. And yes, please, if you need more, tell us tomorrow. We'll be helping you every single day. If Finland were to say this, that would be a different case. And then you would probably see a lot more friction between the little socialist peacenik such as Jake Sullivan and President Biden and his Warren administration and the likes. All of this would be there, but this is not the case. And is there currently a real disconnect between Great Britain, where there's an election coming up on the one hand, and France on the other, and Germany? Not really. They are currently still in the same frame, with the notable exception that Britain is significantly more reliable to defend in view of its position towards Ukraine and its support of Ukraine against Russia. And it's actually no different. If you think about the discussions you can read about, Churchill and FDR seem to have had in the first 3 years of that war, you will end up often with quotes which sound eerily familiar when it comes to forging a strategy which at that point in time was defeat Germany first, and now it should be defeat Russia first, but we're not quite there yet. And it's very difficult that we have currently no credible pro-Ukraine alternative to the Biden administration on the other side. If Nikki Haley were just parallel universe, if take a thought experiment, if she were the candidate on the other side of the Republican Party, she would probably outpoll Biden further than Mr. Trump does at this point in time. I would just wager on this one. But she would definitely be a credible threat to Ukraine on a significantly more impactful level than anybody else. And that would give Putin also pause. At the moment, he doesn't really have to pause. He has one who is 78 years old and the other one is 82 years old. They're both very old. And seemingly Mr. Trump shows that age already in his campaign, and who knows how long that goes well for him. And President Biden has shown his age already. And none of them, I mean, shall we put it this way? It is very unlikely that a 4-year leader of the free world, high octane, high intensity presidency can be easily taken by either one of them. There are physical limits to everything. And the older you are, the more challenging it becomes, because the rest you need in order to recover from that level of stress and responsibility. And I commend President Biden for how he does with it already, because I think it is a significant challenge. Now, think about what that means for the alliance. Not everyone is so, and think about FDR. He was even in a wheelchair, and he went above and beyond because it was an existential war. And this ties in, or ties the bow with Lexicon's concern that currently the advisors of President Biden, as well as the advisors of the leaders of the coalition in the West, which are most important in terms of weapon systems and supply and support, Germany, Italy, France, Great Britain, all of them do not consider it yet a major war. That's a major, major, major concern. That is a significant concern. And it's a pity that in Britain we now have to have an election at a point in time where a change of government, whilst domestically potentially necessary, wanted, whatever, it doesn't matter. Whilst a change of government will change so many things in such a short time frame that even if the replacement by the other party, if they were to come into office, will change so many counterparts that there will be disruption in the supply chain. And the MOD won't be able to hold the line alone. So there are significant challenges in the US, in Britain. I'm quite sure that the European elections will be conducive to more stuff. And that leaves us with the likes of Mr. Scholz leading Europe. And there, Lexicon, I agree with your concern. All righty, before we die a silent death here, I can see that Robin has joined us. Peter.
Yes, I'm still here. Sorry, I was just reading something else at the same time while stuff was being said, so I wasn't fully.
No worries. I was not trying to scold you. On the contrary, I was trying to ask you the question. I mean, given the fact that the general elections now, there's a date for July, early July, and you'll have to deal with it. Then it's almost likely, at least that's what the current poll says, unless Mr. Sunak and the Tories can pull a white rabbit out of the hat, or say an upset of the polls, which is always possible. I'm not trying to predicate anything here. It seems likely that the Liberal Democrats will not win the majority of the votes. And whilst Labour's most recent results in by-elections have not been as good anymore and as immensely supportive as they were before, still they seem to be leading the polls, and I'm quite sure that large parts of the BBC want a Labour government anyway, so you'll be inundated with lots and lots of Labour and pro-Labour, should we say, commentary. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You'll have a change of government in one or the other way. How impactful do you think that will be in summer and throughout the autumn?
Well, yeah. Guess what? I don't like talking about American politics. I don't particularly like talking about British politics. But as I'm a UK resident,
this is about the impact on Ukraine.
Yeah. As I'm a UK resident, it's a reasonable question, and it's good to have it's good to ask a UK resident to and citizen to sort of comment on it. First of all, I was actually taken quite by surprise that it happened, because for those who are not in the UK and don't follow this stuff, and frankly I don't follow it that much because it's just tedious and boring, but the Rishi Sunak government is way behind in the polls. And I suspect that has a lot to do with Liz Truss, who caused an enormous amount of chaos, turmoil, and financial bloody meltdown in her 70 days, or even less than that, whatever days she took to be outlived by a lettuce. And I think people still hold that against the Tories, probably rightly, because it's just ridiculous, and the Tory government are effectively getting pretty stale. Both Truss and Sunak, of course, hadn't actually been elected. They'd just been sort of coronations after Boris had to go. I'm not sure the country is sort of saying, come back, Boris, or anything like that, because I don't think we're at that stage. Although in terms of Ukraine, he was certainly more vocal and did a better job than Sunak does, who pretty much keeps pretty quiet about it. The surprise wild card to me has been Grant Shapps, who's, in my view, is an absolute clown. But so far, apart from putting his foot in his mouth whenever he goes to a radio station by saying something totally stupid, he's actually done a pretty good job. But it is a role which lends itself to sort of self-publicity and self-aggrandizement, of which he is absolutely, you know, if that comes along, he will jump on that bandwagon every time. In terms of the change of government, for the people who are not sort of up with UK politics, everybody, all the pundits here are predicting a pretty big landslide in favour of Labour, which we haven't really had since 1997. And the Labour government, Labour Party rather, seems to do this. They go through years in the wilderness out of power and sort of go through several meltdowns, try every sort of crazy alternative, including Jeremy Corbyn, which was a pretty bonkers thing to have attempted to do, who is basically as a sort of rabid communist, pretty much pro Hamas and pro Moscow and pro Kremlin, and would just, there's no way the country would, and economically just in cloud cuckoo land, and there's no way the country just rejected him decisively, and he was sent packing. So we're now faced with this guy called Keir Starmer, who's a sort of legal whiz. Seems to have the personality of a paper bag, and just is not really, and has zero charisma as well. But he's quite good at
and he bangs on this because he tries to set himself apart from what he decries as the chaos, Boris Johnson, the incompetence of Liz Truss, the woman who could not outlast a cabbage, and then Mr. Sunak,
a cabbage as well as a lettuce.
Well, we did both cabbage and lettuce. The lettuce was on British television, and people in Ukraine follow this on cabbage news. This is the separation between those who like kraut on the continent, meaning everything from the center all the way to the northeast and southeast, kraut countries, and lettuce, But she didn't outlast any of them.
Yeah. So get back to the question, which I've sort of skirted around, is what is going to be the effect on Ukraine? And the answer is we really don't know, because Keir Starmer has not had to do much and say much. He's just let the Tories sort of implode and spontaneously self-immolate themselves, which they're extremely good at doing. Sunak, actually, in my view, hasn't actually done a bad job since he's been in. He hasn't said enough on Ukraine, in my view, and he hasn't been strong enough, and he hasn't sort of provided the sort of leadership that I would have liked to see on that matter. But that, to be fair to him, that's not really his sort of wheelhouse. He's more into sort of the economic steady hand, and particularly given the mess he inherited from Truss, that was probably his priority. But he has continued the aid to Ukraine. That wouldn't have been signed off without his support, and it has increased, I think. Probably not as much as I'd like to see, and the sort of, some things have happened good, like the 2 military ammunition plants have been stepped up to full production, which they haven't in certain other countries I could mention. And some things but it sort of smacks me of not really enough. So what's going to happen when Starmer comes in? Well, in theory, nothing should change, and he certainly is supportive of Ukraine. The thing I worry about is there's a lot of people in his party who are sympathetic to the Kremlin, sympathetic to Palestine and Hamas in particular, and they may not say they're sympathetic to Hamas, but bloody hell they are. And there's people even been had to be excluded from the party on that basis and have lost the whip or lost the blooming whatever. I think that's the case. They've had to be stood down because of stupid things they've said. And he is always going to be under pressure from that sort of radical wing of the party to go more and do further. And I think he's trying. I mean, the Labour Party, by the way, has a historic problem with anti-Semitism, and Corbyn was up to his neck in that, and all his sort of left-wing people, and they got themselves entangled up in a total mess with in multiple occasions and that by not dealing with it properly. So that's another aspect which is sort of problematic. The only good thing from my point of view, speaking as somebody who's frankly doesn't really support any of the political parties here, because they're all a bunch of scumbags, sleazebags, lining their own pockets and serving their own interests rather than our interests. The only thing is that the sort of silver light, every cloud has a silver lining, is that if this thing's all going to be finished in 4 to 5 weeks, then we'll get it over with, and it won't be dragging on into the autumn and winter. And quite importantly, from the point of stability, we will have a new British government in place in advance of the American government. The last thing you would really want to have is the American and UK governments changing hands or potentially changing hands in a fairly dramatic or sensitive way as far as Ukraine is concerned at the same time, particularly with everything else that's happened.
Which is why Mr. Sunak had another good reason to go for it right now and before the US election, rather than having a general election during the time when the US is in transition.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that will be good for the world, and particularly good for Ukraine, because it will give a sort of a more stable transition than might otherwise be the case. And that's sort of good for those who don't follow the sort of UK system. Basically, we have elections every something like 4 or 5 years, something like that, and there is a time limit by which the incumbent government has to make a decision, so that they cannot run it indefinitely. And in our case, the time limit is, I think it's about strange enough, about January the 20th. It's mid-January or something like that. So that's the latest the election can be. But the existing government can call it earlier if they so wish, and they would normally do that. They wouldn't normally run it down to the wire, and they tend to avoid elections in sort of Christmas and New Year period, because it's just not a good time. So July the 4th again is quite sort of a reasonable time. I think it's always on a Thursday, because they avoid Fridays because people are going home at the end of the week or whatever, and like with all our elections, so it will be on a Thursday. And the Prime Minister can basically choose when it's going to be, and he could have chosen May, he could have chosen July, or he could have chosen the autumn, or he could have run it down to the wire, basically to December. I mean, in theory, he could have done January, but he wouldn't have done that. He'd have probably done the early December as the last sort of reasonable time before Christmas. But frankly, that's not ideal. And I think it's sort of gutsy from his point of view to go for it when he's clearly so far behind in the polls, and it looks like the Tories, the Conservative incoming in government, which is in power at the moment over here and has been for about 15 years or so. It looks like they're going to get quite a kicking, and probably deserve it, quite honestly. But the problem is, Labour isn't really offering anything better, and Keir Starmer is so woolly and so sort of just vomit worthy. It's not clear what he actually is offering. He doesn't really seem to have any policies. He's just not saying anything.
He needs to hide. Labour's hardcore left-wing aspirations. That's what he's good for.
Yeah. So his policy, which actually is a good one, is just to say nothing and hope he gets in by default. And I think there was some research recently which said he had the lowest ratings of any opposition politician and that presumably must include Corbyn, which is bloody crazy. But Corbyn, of course, did have this massive cult fan club around him. They're all deluded, they're all crazy, left-wing communists, sort of dyed-in-the-wool socialists, sort of.
And Corbyn was is a major anti-Semite, in addition to all his Moscow-leaning policies and Marxism.
Yeah, I mean, he's not, well, the country, the UK would have been in real trouble had he got elected, and fortunately, most of the electorate could see that, and they even voted for somebody like Boris Johnson as an alternative, because I think most of the electorate, frankly, could also see that Boris was a load of trouble and was probably not the best person to be Prime Minister of our country. However, we had the choice between Boris Johnson on the one hand and Jeremy Corbyn on the other hand. Frankly, I'll say a pretty unpalatable choice. Okay, Boris did really well on Ukraine. He came out on fire there and did really well, and I'm the first to give him credit for that. But on a whole load of other things, he was distinctly dodgy. And you can only get away with that so many times, and his luck ran out basically. Well, not luck. He just pushed it one times too many. But Starmer. Well, can he basically hold? Because the Labour Party as well is a sort of load of factions, and half the time they're at war with themselves. And can he hold them together? Can he basically deal with the big decisions that need to be made on Ukraine, on defence, on the fact our health service isn't spending the money it's got very well, and is hospital queues are getting worse. English education is actually doing pretty well at the moment, bizarrely, although there's sort of shortage of funding for schools and the actual buildings and stuff like that. Transports are frankly a bit of a mess. Various other things are, but these things are relative. I mean, if you compare this to what's going on in Russia, well, bloody hell, I mean, we're in a completely different boat and we're leagues ahead of them. So, but we shouldn't really compare our situation with a sort of the fascist nonsense that's going on in Russia, and a country run by criminals who are stealing everything. So that's maybe a not of good comparison, but compared to Germany and France, we're not doing badly, I think, and we'll have to see what happens. Of course, there's the big thing about Europe as well. There's a lot of people within the Labour Party, and there are even some people in the Conservative Party who want to rejoin Europe. That's going to be a bit of a festering wound, I think, that will need to be dealt with. Starmer says that he respects the outcome of the referendum, which was very close, by the way, 52% to 48%. So however you look at it, the country was pretty evenly divided, and going for a sort of hard exit where we sort of, cut our ties with Europe probably isn't popular with 48% of the population, and sort of some sort of compromise might have been a better solution. But it's difficult to compromise when it's an all or nothing. It's an in-out decision. I mean, we weren't given the option of, well, do you want to sort of have reasonable ties with Europe, but maintain ties, but not do this and do that or whatever. It was a fairly clear question, and we got the results. So what's going to happen in the future? Who knows? I happen to think that Europe's probably got bigger problems than we have, particularly with countries like Hungary causing trouble, and sort of the economy, the sort of the economies of Europe not being sort of economically aligned, but being tied into the same currency. They either sort of have to federalize, which would seem unwise and undesirable, or they're going to have these diverging and non-convergent economies sort of doing different things and causing problems for each other. And effectively, because Germany in particular is the economic sort of engine of Europe, then things are going to sort of probably go Germany's way economically, potentially to the disadvantage of some of the other countries. And that's why I would like to see, and I'm delighted to see the sort of center of political centre of gravity within the EU shift eastwards towards Poland, Scandinavia, and the Baltics in particular. Certainly politically, not sure that is the case economically, but anyway. Long ramble there, but I think the simple answer to the question is, what's the effect of Ukraine going to be on the change to Labour government if we change to Labour? I think none of us really know, and we just have to see how Keir Starmer handles it. He's not saying a lot, but what he is saying is kind of good enough for Ukraine, and makes it clear that he's going to support Ukraine and there won't be a change of policy. But within that, there's a lot of that's fairly sort of unspecific. There's a lot of potential questions that arise where we haven't really seen a lot of clarity, and knowing what a waffler he is, I frankly wouldn't really trust anything that he says now, and when he comes into power, whether he'll be able to keep a grip on these sort of agents of chaos within his own ranks. I would highly question, but looks like we're going to get to find out, because if you believe what the pundits and the polls are saying over here, we are in for a change of government, and that happens in the UK very abruptly and very dramatically. So we have an election on July the 4th, and assuming it's a decisive outcome, which it usually is, because we have a first past the post system, not a sort of proportional representation where you tend to get sort of hung parliaments or an inconclusive result. We did actually get that in 2010, but that was highly unusual and almost unprecedented. And we had a coalition government, but that's virtually never happened before, and the mathematics were very specific on that instance, and it seems that will not be the case now. So what basically happens on July the 4th is there's the election, assuming the outcome is sort of clear and decisive. The leader of the opposition goes to see the king the next day, and basically a removal truck arrives at Downing Street, number 10 Downing Street, which is the official residence of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister moves out that afternoon, and that's it. It is a very brutal process. There's no month or month and a half 2 months transition as there is in America, with a sort of smooth handover of power. No, it is that the civil service handles the handover of power, and the outgoing Prime Minister is just unceremonially ejected on his ear and get out overnight. It's literally that brutal. And this is good, because it keeps it reminds our politicians that they are only there by the power of the people, and if the people don't want them, then that's it, they are ditched there and then. And that's actually quite good, and the civil service seems to be able to do a reasonable enough job of handing over the reins. Famously, the last time the Labour outgoing government went there, a Labour bloke from the Treasury left a note saying, advice to my successor, just be aware there's no money left, and left this on a post-it note. And of course, the incoming government made rather sort of hay of this, and the outgoing Labour guy probably wished he hadn't done that, because it got hung around his neck repeatedly by the incoming Tory Conservative government. Anyway, Axel, you wanted to say something?
No, I was just saying, it's so funny that you highlight this, because the brutality is due to the fact that the civil service is so happy to ensure that everybody knows that they're in charge, and Simon Case will probably be there greeting whoever comes in the door on that day, respectively whoever stays in the door. Because that's the other thing, if there's a hung parliament, because maybe Labour and its policies are not as popular as people would like it to believe. The Tories are maybe quite incompetent and are losing a lot of those who stood for an election beforehand. And you might even end up with the Lib Dems having a substantial number of votes. And then you end up with a parliament which can't find a real sensible majority, albeit that it looks highly likely that Keith Starmer and his camouflage tactic for socialism is going to win. If that's the case, then you can only hope that Mr. Case and others in Whitehall will prevent the country from going from one hot bath of incompetence to the absolute dismal bath of re-establishing socialism in Britain.
Yes, the phrase "out of the frying pan and into the fire" comes to mind, doesn't it?
Well, you had Evil Tony and the one-eyed Scot, and you managed to somehow survive it. But then again, there you go.
Yeah, just to inform our listeners who maybe not from the UK, the situation with Scotland, which is quite interesting. As you probably know, there's been an ongoing sort of thing about the Scots having independence. They were granted their own parliament again for the first time, I think, since 1707, in about 20 years ago. And broadly speaking, that's been successful in sort of running their own affairs, although they appear to have run their own affairs pretty badly. Hospitals are in a mess, education's in a mess, the budget's in a mess and is heavily subsidised by England, among other things, and probably even Wales. Frankly, the Scots have not had a very good government. They're just obsessed. The government who they have got are just obsessed by independence and are not really focusing on the things that they should be focusing on. In addition to which, Scotland, which was traditionally was always heavily Labour, the Labour sort of had a meltdown and lost it completely, and it all went to Scottish National. The Scottish National Party has now had their own meltdown and got involved in all sorts of scandals, financial, sexual, almost everything. Backed by the money from the Kremlin and all sorts of nonsense. And there now is sort of the supposition that a lot of those seats are going to go back to Labour. And fundamentally, if Scotland does go independent, without the votes from Scotland, the Labour Party would probably never get in England. The Labour, in order for Labour to get into power, they are effectively dependent on a load of the Scottish vote to balance, to sort of balance themselves out. And even though Scotland is only 5% of the UK population, it's still significant in terms of the number of constituencies and the sort of share of the vote which counts towards the first past the post system. So it's sort of interesting, and it's all in transition, and we don't really know. And of course, there is a little bit of historical precedent where I think last time they were predicting that Corbyn was going to do a lot better than he actually did, and when the British voters actually face the hard light of day and have to put their cross in the box for somebody like Corbyn or Keir Starmer or something else like that, there may be more of them who come out and say, well, better the devil you know, than some unknown risk that where it could all go terribly wrong. But we just don't know. We just have to see what happens. But the good thing is, we'll find out pretty soon. And it's not going to drag on for all of the autumn and winter, which frankly would be a sort of living hell. So I'm reasonably comfortable that it's happening on July the 4th. Let's just bloody get on with it, get it over. And if we have to make a change, then, well, let's get on with it and just cross our fingers and hope for the best. And there won't be too much damage. But to be honest, my faith in any of them is in a very low bar. But there you go. That's the way we are now. I think we seem to be, the political system seems to be generating candidates of the sort of lowest common denominator. Maybe that's a bit unfair, but it just seems to be doesn't seem to be good at picking good people out who are actually can do the job and have confidence of the country and are respected and trusted by the electorate. And I think the sort of undermining of trust in politicians has been a big theme in the UK in the last sort of 10, 15, 20 years. Anyway, there's a few thoughts from me.
All right, and by the way, I've outstayed my welcome. Really, I should have gone already a little bit earlier, but then again, I was 20 minutes late due to the host phone issues 2 hours ago. So I hope that everything is all right. Robin, if I'm not quite mistaken, you are here to replace me. That would be wonderful if that's possible. And with that, I shall bid you goodbye. Peter, good luck with the start of the week. Let's hope that the support of Great Britain remains as unwavering, as dedicated as it has been throughout the week, and then we'll take it from there. Good night and good luck, everyone.
Thank you, Axel, and good night, and thank you for co-hosting with me. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, I certainly do hope that Britain is as steadfast as we have been. And one thing that has slightly disappointed me, I don't know, is that I would like to. I mean, one of the things is that Britain does have disproportionate influence with the United States, I think, and even though you could say the United States is going to do its own thing, and it will do, they do listen to us, and we have sort of soft power which can be exerted, and at times we know how to use that. And I would like to have seen a lot more have going on with the Brits and Rishi Sunak in particular, basically explaining to the Americans and trying to encourage the Americans to allow the American military equipment and missiles and everything else, including F-16s, to be used on Russian territory. It's absolutely ridiculous that that restriction is put there, and all this scandal with Blinken and everything else that's blown up in the recently, and Scholz as well, of course. And I think I would like to see Britain pressing much harder, together with all the other countries. I gather Sweden has just announced today that they're of the same mind. Finland's already said so. I don't actually know which other countries are in the same boat and which ones are in the Sullivan and Scholz boat. But it's just absurd that the Ukrainians know exactly where all the concentrations of Russian forces are over the border. They know where all these planes are taking off from. They know where the missiles are being fired from, and they basically can't do anything about it until the missiles enter Ukrainian territory, by which time, of course, it's far too late. And that's just ridiculous. They need to take out the launch sites. They need to take out all the airfields. They're being, these attacks are being launched from. And I was again incensed last night to see another 10, potentially 10 Tu-95s or whatever they are taken off from Alenia Air Base. It may have been less than that. Some of them came from Saratov, apparently, Engel's place at Saratov. But we know where these bases are. We are, by our inaction, are allowing this bloody Alenia Air Base in Murmansk to just launch repeated attacks against Ukrainian civilians. That airbase in particular is right on NATO's border. We have the easy capability of taking that airbase and all the aircraft there out easily. Now, I don't care what you say about escalation. I don't care what you say about the risks of reaction from Moscow. Just get on with it and do it. And the same goes for the other ones. There's no way realistically the Ukrainians can take out Alenia Air Base near Murmansk. It's just too far away. We need to be saying to the Russians, and I mean, the UK, France, USA, NATO, anybody who's prepared to do it, the Baltics, Finland, Sweden, and the coalition of the willing. It doesn't have to be all of NATO, but enough countries that are willing to say, if you're going to persist in launching attacks against Ukrainian civilians from these airfields, right, we are going to whack those airfields so they are put out of use. So don't do it or expect the consequences. And if NATO or a particular country within NATO, and we don't need to tell the Russians which countries it is, we just need to do it. And if we put that airbase out of action and then said to them, well, by the way, if you do it from Engels or Pskov or any other airbase, we'll do the same thing there. They'll get the message, right? And what are they going to do? Are they going to launch a nuclear attack against us or Sweden or anybody else? No, they're not. They'll just huff and puff as usual. They'll wheel Lavrov out. Medvedev will go on a drunken rant on Twitter, and they'll basically get the message, and they'll have to stop attacking Ukraine by these methods, because they will understand that if they do, sequentially, one by one, all the air bases they're using will get taken out. And that's the way, frankly, we should be dealing with this. It's also the way we should be dealing with Crimea, by saying, if you're going to launch ships, missiles from ships, bang, your ships are going to suddenly pop out of the, going to get sunk. And we shouldn't be relying on the Ukrainians to do that. NATO should be doing that. The Romanians and others in the area should be taking command of the situation and recognizing it as a threat to them and taking a lead on it. And by our inaction, there comes a point which we are complicit with the death and the what is in effect genocide of Ukrainians. Remember the Rabbi Niemoller's comment that just by standing by, I didn't do anything because they didn't come from me. They were coming for, firstly, well, it was Jews, then it was communists, then it was whatever. And the next thing, I was the only one left. And the last thing, well, of course, what a surprise, they came for me. And it's exactly the same scenario. NATO is just standing by, letting the Russians get away with it. And bear in mind that the Russians are absolutely clear, or the Kremlin is absolutely clear that it is already at war with America. It considers the Ukrainian conflict to be a proxy war of America, and NATO. So frankly, they might as well blooming get on with it and sort the problem out, rather than trying to pretend it's a different problem, or even that the problem isn't there, before China and every other bad actor gets in on the act to make things worse and raise the cost of it for all of us. Anyway, that's another rant, and I will finish that by welcoming Robin on board. Good evening, Robin. How are you doing?
Terrific, thanks. Good rant. I no complaints about it. I everything you say, and I agree, and even more. By the way, I thank you for giving us Martin Niemöller as a rabbi, but he unfortunately, in fact, was a Lutheran pastor, so we Jews can't take credit for him. Wonderful man.
Oh,
But
sorry.
That's
That's my mistake.
nothing to be sorry about. I thought it was funny. I wouldn't mind. Anyway.
Oops.
Yeah, no, and I think I was just looking at there's a very brief article in Ukrainska Pravda where President Zelensky. I like the way he worded this. He says that Ukraine should be allowed to make preventive killing of terrorists. And I think this is really this is a good way to couch it, because it's really what they want to do is take care of the issue before the attack comes into Ukraine. It's what you were talking about. I honestly don't think that the rest of the countries of the world will ever have the cojones to actually go and do bombing inside of Russia. But if we give Ukraine everything it needs, I don't think we would need to anyway. And you're 100% right. I mean, I can't imagine. Well, all of this would not have happened if Ukraine was able to use those high-tech weapons that we've given them to do what they're meant to do. Russia would not have been able to set up, a perimeter with impunity and put all these weapons just across the border and just take pot shots at Kharkiv. I don't know. You probably have seen someone who works with MriyaReport spent quite a lot of time in Ukraine, and he had a clip of this home center, Epicenter was called this. It's basically, for Americans, it's a huge Home Depot kind of place. And he put up a couple of days ago a video that he shot inside that store, and it looks like my local Home Depot, and I think it's important, people for always to remember what were people doing there? Russia has been trying to destroy Kharkiv. The citizens of Kharkiv what do? They go and they rebuild everything that gets broken. They try to rebuild as fast as they can. So I mean, the cynicism involved. The Russians had to know that this home improvement center was going to have a lot of people in it, because there's a lot of damage that people are repairing. And I saw, Peter, I don't know if you had seen this. I saw a still photograph, a little boy who's apparently 8 years old, Mikhailo, and he was with the police doing a DNA swab because the only way they were going to be able to identify his father, who worked in that center, was by a DNA match, because the bodies that they had found that hadn't been matched to names yet were so badly burned that there was no way to recognize them. This is what's going on, and this is what. Excuse me, Mr. Schultz. This is already a major war. Excuse me. It's not. I don't understand this man, and I honestly I don't. Jake Sullivan has got to go too. Anthony Blinken. I just pray that Anthony Blinken doesn't get so disgusted that he quits, because he has really been fighting the good fight here, and he has been, telegraphing as clearly as he can that he is totally in favor of giving Ukraine the green light to use these weapons in the way that they were intended to be used. Ukraine doesn't target civilians. Ukraine doesn't do all of doesn't perpetrate war crimes the way Russia does every day of the week, and it just makes absolutely no sense that they have to sit and watch Russia destroy their second major city. The Institute for the Study of War today was saying that they think they are identifying this as the Aleppo strategy, and I think they're right. What Russia wants to do is render Kharkiv totally uninhabitable, and just flatten it to the ground. And we are complicit as long as we don't let Ukraine use the weapons that they already have and get them other weapons and allow them to use them in a way to protect themselves. That's all they want to do. Ukraine has made it clear, and it's clear by their actions that they have absolutely no designs on any inch of Russian soil. They just want the Russians to get the hell out of their country and leave them alone, which, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Obviously, that's the right. Supporting them 100% is the right thing to do. Anyway, how's that for my rant, Peter?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, Sullivan certainly has to go, really, and Schultz, yeah, I don't know. I mean, to my mind, he's just compromised and a confused character, and just a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I think most Germans seem to realise that. And there was some discussion that he was going to get voted out, but it hasn't happened yet. And time after time, he just displays himself as just completely not up to the job, and a coward. And no doubt the Germans have got compromat on him. He's sort of ideologically compromised and just cannot basically cope with the reality of what's happened and the seriousness of the situation and what it actually means, that Germany should, just cannot basically, treat Russia as normal. And he's now, even worse, going off to China and doing the same thing as China, doing exactly the same thing with China, making the same mistake over again when, Germany has got itself into a mess by being over dependent on Russian cheap gas and energy resources. And he's now going over to China and saying, well, we've lost Russia, we've got to replace it with somebody, let's become heavily dependent on China, when he should be doing exactly the opposite, saying from a political point of view what China is doing is unacceptable. German companies need to be divesting themselves of Chinese production and Chinese subsidiaries, and actually isolating China and making it clear to China, if they're going to continue on an aggressive course towards Taiwan and other neighbors, then we won't. They won't be doing business with us. And we need to start to show them we're serious about that, and prohibiting German companies from expansion in the Chinese market, and compelling them to basically leave their Chinese outsourced production operations, and Germany should stand on its own 2 feet and effectively not have an unfair advantage economically against all the other countries in Europe, which is basically what they had with all their shenanigans with Russian gas and stuff. And we only need to look back at the Nord Stream thing to see how that was, how that sort of went. So you know, it's difficult because I'm not a German citizen, so I don't have a say. But it certainly irks the hell out of me that this idiot is still there and still causing problems and just doesn't get it. You know, the situation with Taurus is the most obvious manifestation of that. And you know, it absolutely stands to reason that Scholz should be absolutely delighted when the Ukrainians are using German weapons against Russian targets within Russia, because that directly will guarantee German national security, against which the Kremlin is a very severe threat, and is not a partner, and is not somebody we can do business with, and is not somebody that we can somehow do any reset with or stitch up the relationship. It is finished, and we need to basically get fundamental root and branch change in the Kremlin and within Moscow completely, before we can even consider you know, any kind of new relationship. And we should send a signal to them loud and clear that the bridges are burnt, and you know, this kind of behavior in terms of genocide, invasions, deportations, and all the rest of it is totally unacceptable. And we're going to say, take the action as we do with what we say, and we're going to back that up with weapons and ammunition and everything that we can, and get industry you know, fully fired up behind the Ukrainians, and allow them, or even encourage them, to use those weapons against targets on the ground in Russia, because that is what is threatening Ukraine, and that's where all the attacks are coming from. You know, even the ones where they've placed men and equipment inside Ukrainian territory, well, guess where they came from originally? From Russia, of course. So that's what really needs to be done, and until we actually grasp that nettle and get on with it, then you know, we're going to have problems. And I would actually like to see the UK government and the American government sanctioning people like Schroeder and other Germans who've been supportive of Moscow. Their president Steinmeier is another one. He's an absolutely awful slime bag, although he seems to have turned the corner, but that's not good enough after all the cavorting he did with Putin. And of course, the other one is the Austrians. We should have Raiffeisenbank and a whole load of bad actors in Austria sanctioned by the UK and the US, and the same with other Kremlin stooges like Orban. You know, we should be sanctioning these people and should be making them basically pariahs, and you know, going much further than we've gone so far. Not to mention all the oligarchs who are quietly living nice lives in Dubai, and you know, carrying on as usual and quietly erasing all their biographies, removing any reference to having had dealings with Putin or his genocidal regime. So yeah, just a few things that I would want to see done. And yeah, let's go back to you, Robin.
I know, totally agree with you. You know, all of this really, for me, boils down to a lack of moral clarity. You guys were talking before I came up about FDR and you know, about politicians that we had in the past. Now, I have my problems with some of the things FDR did. I think we've had our problems with Churchill, with, you know, with anyone, but the excuses that are made these days for why we have to be in bed with Russia or China or anything else, it's not the kind of thing that would have flown 50, 100 years ago. I mean, they didn't do everything right, but at the same time, but look at the genocide of the Uyghurs. That's been going on in China for years, and why does no one say anything? It's still, you know, people try to push, but nothing happens, and it's been going on for a long time, and still it's business as usual with them. The same thing with getting gas from Russia. I mean, it should be a no-brainer that we take the hit, maybe make our lives internally a little bit harder for a while in order to not be entangled with people who are doing totally reprehensible things. But that just doesn't seem to be an issue anymore. So it's I'm not sure how we change that. I think, you know, you mentioned before that we don't seem to get the quality of people in public office anymore. I'm not sure if that's as real as it is apparent because, you know, like with Church, I'm not, with Roosevelt, they made a point of not filming him, not photographing him in his wheelchair. You know, so the people were not as aware of his infirmities. But and I'm sure that went on with certain things that would have been all over the press these days. But still, it is an issue. We don't seem to get quality moral leaders in office that often anymore. Anyway, back to you, Peter.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And there's been a sort of steady deterioration of the quality of political leaders and also the trust in the voters. These two have sort of gone up in tandem, rather they've gone down in tandem, if you like. And I think they sort of reflect each other. Anyway, we've got two hands up. Let's go to, I don't know who was first, but let's go to Dan and then Karen.
Hey, Dan the man, you there?
I'm just trying to get in. Yeah, Karen was first, by the way.
Okay, should we go to Karen first? Sorry about that, Karen.
Well, I just wanted to interject. You know, it's not a big thing, but hopefully it will be a trend. In Ukrainian form, I just read today that Sweden has given permission to Ukraine to use any of their weapons for strikes inside Russia. Now, if enough countries do this, this should help a little bit. It still doesn't make up for the U.S. I'm hoping that we can get squared away on that. It took us a while to get the $61 billion package through, and I'm hoping that we can work further on allowing Ukraine to use these weapons as they need to. But the fact that Sweden has made this statement, I think, is like it's like the first snowball falling in the avalanche. What I'm hoping it will be. This is what I'm hoping it will be, because Sweden has been doing a lot in terms of ammunition production, and they have just been wonderfully supportive, you know, and even though they've only just become a NATO country. So I thought I would bring that up because it sounds like you guys can use some good news today, and hopefully this will be a trend. And, you know, I've got to, this is something slightly different off the topic, but, you know, we're talking about a lot of the planes coming from bases, you know, Russian planes coming from bases up near Murmansk and Olena Air Base, and doing their dirty work down in Ukraine. Well, I'd like to know, I just read an article in Barron's Observer. They have the effort, you know, available, and the money to bomb Ukraine from the far north. But this article says that the Archangel authorities have taken people's benefits to support the Ukraine war. And this is from the Barron's Observer. Has found that many of the sponsors of war in the Archangel region, and that is, or you know, kind of the region we're talking about, have turned out to be they found that the main sponsors of this war have turned out to be the socially vulnerable, and millions of rubles have been taken away from students foster children, retired workers, and redistributed to soldiers going to Ukraine. So they are doing this, and it is hurting them badly. And that's the news that I have to share.
Okay,
Okay,
thank
thanks,
you,
Karen.
Karen. Yeah, thank you, Peter. I just wanted to mention something. I just realized we're 10 minutes to the top of the hour. I just want to let everyone know we are having a scheduled restart of the space at the top of the hour, 5 o'clock Eastern, whatever, 10 minutes from now. So just be aware. We'll continue until that, but we will make a restart and then ask everybody to please, as we restart, come back in. Share and retweet. And also, I'd like to ask you: we as you know, Twitter put in a new option a while ago to listen anonymously. We'd like to ask our listeners, if at all possible, to please not use that option unless you really need to, because it limits our reach. It makes it appear as though we have many fewer listeners than we actually have. So obviously, if you need to for some reason, go ahead. But if you have an option of listening anonymously or not, it really helps us out. It helps our reach, helps Ukraine. It helps us to be more visible if you're coming up not as an anonymous listener. So anyway, okay, 9 minutes from now we're going to do a restart. So we'll just FYI. Back to you, Peter.
Okay, thanks, Robin. And yeah, that is in 10 minutes' time, which is 2200 British Summer Time, or is that UTC, or UTC's 1 hour behind that? And that'll be midnight Kiev time, and that happens to be the time at which I think I am due to be relieved and hand over to possibly James Healy. So when we do go down at in about 8 minutes time or thereabouts, then it'll be time for me to say goodbye. So I will do that well, almost now, whatever. Or I will sort of anticipate that happening in sort of 8 minutes or so time, and then you'll be back up, Robin, I understand, for another hour or so to get the site restart and get the space restarted. And then again, or if all our listeners would sort of come back to the new space, then that would be certainly appreciated. And the American contingent will take you into the night. Well, into the night as far as we are concerned here, and into the afternoon and evening as far as they are concerned in the States. So there we go. Good time to remind you now that you're listening to MriyaReport, which is Twitter's only 24/7 space. We are raising money for various causes in Ukraine, and if you look at what is now the second tweet in the nest, or the second post in the nest, you will see our current fundraiser is for power for Kharkiv, in particular generators, for solar power generators for hospitals, maintaining vital life-saving operations and equipment and capabilities in that city, which is under horrendous attack, along with others like Kherson and many others. Dnipro got a nailing last night, I gather. So please do contribute to that if you can, and we will do what we can to support various causes in Ukraine, and also sort of disinfect the Russian disinformation narratives and the information space. So the next one is we've got Dan's hand up, so let's go to Dan.
Yeah, I just wanted to say this before you leave. Thank you very much for being up on the space today, co-hosting with Alex and James earlier. I'm just going to say this this is my personal thing. I'm not saying this is for everybody. When I go to vote for somebody that runs a country, and I'm not bad mouthing my president at all, but when I vote for a president, senator, representative, or anything, I look for character. I'm lucky I do have a senator and a representative. Their characters are fairly good. I mean, they do excellent work for humanity and for their constituents on the human level. But what I go to look for is character. That's the first and furthermost thing. You know, they think, I don't know what they think. I think they're being advised and told sometimes by their political operatives that, you know, work with them during a campaign. You got to do this, or no, you're going to lose votes if you do this, or you got to do this. This is how you want to do. And then these people follow them into office, and they keep this up while they're in office. And then I think somewhere down the road, from my point of view, I think they lose the view of what their major consensus was. And if I remember, it was rights for all, jobs for everybody here in the States, you know, stamp out corruption, or, you know, get rid of the bad guy, which we did the first time. But anyways, yeah, and people that committed crimes in the previous administration got let off the hook, and there was no follow-up. We got a crazy SCOTUS. But anyways, I look for character. That's the first thing I vote for. Any other issue, that's a sidebar for me. I can go along with any other issue. The first thing that is important for me, Russia, I'm sorry, needs to be declared a terrorist state by my leading official. And I would like to see my representatives and senator do the same. Tell my leading official, this is a terrorist state. We need to put it down on paper and start the sanctions even further. This is not going to go away until we start treating people the way their actions are. Before we deal with any other little diddly social program or anything else that we need for that particular country or constituency, you know, without looking at your campaign or what you think you're going to get voted in or out for, show some character. And I know this person has character. I would like these people to show more character. Stick by your guns. Voters, electorate be damned. Do what's right for humanity. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Peter, for being up there today.
You're welcome, Dan. Thanks very much for the kind comments. I do appreciate it. I just, as always, I just say what I think and speak my opinions. And you know, if people agree with them, that's great. And if people disagree with them, then perhaps we, you know, we can have a discussion as always or whatever. I don't really get too many disagreements up here, but I just kind of, you know, what you see is what you get, really. I don't beat about the bush. I just say what I think. And you know, with regard to Russia, I have quite strong opinions. Lived there for quite a few years, understand the country, work there, have effectively unable to run a business. I used to take groups across Russia and across the Trans-Siberian and between Moscow and St. Petersburg, traveled all over the country. A few places I haven't been to, but traveled sort of, you know, from north to south and east to west, as you say, and know the country and understand the people and the mentality and the mindset pretty well. I think sometimes I make mistakes, sometimes I misjudge them or I misjudge the situation. We're all human, we all make mistakes, but fundamentally, I reckon I have a pretty good handle on what's going on there, and frankly, a far better handle than most of our politicians who just don't seem to get it or don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation or really how to deal with the Kremlin. And you know, that's one of the things that frustrates me, and particular with sanctions and you know, dealing with a lot of these bad actors, and I include people like Schroeder and Orban and various others in that, the load of people in Vienna and Austria as well. And you know, they need to be dealt with. There should be no beating about the bush. And you know, if we don't deal with them, then what happens, as Gary Kasparov says, is that Putin will escalate and raise the cost, and the next time it will become much more expensive to deal with. And we've repeatedly seen this. You know, if we dealt with all the problems after Georgia or after Crimea, certainly after Crimea, there was no doubt about what the game plan was and what was going on, and you know, there's no room for doubt as to what the Kremlin was up to, which potentially there could be a case for saying there was after Georgia in 2008. But There we go. So thanks so much for your comments. We got to the top of the hour, and we
the space went down right as you were leaving. So anyway, thank you, Peter, so much for co-hosting with me. I just wanted to mention something quickly while James is getting some new tweets up in the nest. That's a good one. One of the things we haven't talked about lately, and understandably because of what's been going